So I think we should start. So I'm usually giving an undergraduate microeconomics class here, and when I say we should start, it's never going so quickly being silent as this time. And never so many people show up to my lectures. Welcome everybody. It's my great privilege as the chairman of the Department of Economics and the director of the UBS International Center of Economics in Society to welcome you to this event. I particularly welcome our speaker, Daniel Kahneman. It is an immense honor and pleasure to have you here and to present insights from your fascinating book. Welcome, Danny. A special welcome also to the members of the executive board of the University of Zurich, our rector, to the numerous leaders of Swiss and international companies, to the members of various political bodies, and to all the others who came here and who want to see Daniel Kahneman. A special welcome also to those unfortunate people who couldn't enter the hall. Some of them, roughly 700 or 800 people, they had to go to a different lecture room, and we broadcast the lecture to the other room. We tried our best. We went from the Aula to this room, where many more people can come, but still there are too many who wanted to get in. Now let me introduce the speaker. For an academic like me, being able to present Daniel Kahneman as a speaker is as good as it can get, really. Daniel Kahneman is one of the giants of the social and behavioral sciences in the last 40 years, and perhaps one of the biggest living, the most important, most famous, most influential living psychologist. He has made truly path-breaking contributions that deeply shaped psychology and economics, and he is one of the founding fathers of behavioral economics, a subfield in economics that is successfully penetrating standard economics over the last 20 to 30 years. Although Daniel is a psychologist by training, he has been awarded the Nobel Prize in Economics, which, by the way, should tell you a lot about economics. It's a much less dogmatic science than many of you think. And he got the Nobel Prize for the integration of psychological research into economic science, especially concerning human judgment and decision-making under uncertainty. His tremendously successful research program, developed with his friend and co-author Amos Tversky, also contributed probably to the foundation of the Society of Judgment and Decision-Making. In fact, the whole field has been probably generated by this research line. If I would name all the other prizes and honors that he received over the years, we would still be here tomorrow morning. More recently, Danny, who wrote many influential papers, has also become a best-selling book author with the popular book, Thinking Fast and Slow. In this book, he summarizes much of the research he has conducted over the last few decades, covering his work on cognitive biases, on prospect theory, and his later work on the sources and regularities of human happiness. Despite the intellectual depth and width of the book, it became an instant commercial success. I became aware of this success when I went through many different airports, and in every tiny bookshop there, where I passed through, I saw your book displayed next to the latest John Grisham crime novel. That's usually not something an academic book achieves. And then, it's not just that you wrote this book, it's also that this book is largely about research, or a lot about research you have conducted. It's not about research, it's also about research that others have conducted, but you contributed a lot. It's your research that you present there. Now, the prizes and awards for the book duly followed. It became the winner of the National Academy of Sciences Best Book Award. It was selected by the New York Times Book Review as one of the best books of the year. It was one of the Economist's Book of the Year, and it was one of the Wall Street Journal's best nonfiction book of the year. And this stellar success, which is very untypical for a top scientist, is hardly astonishing given that you eloquently and in plain language address topics that are of key importance to most of us. How do we make decisions? Why are managers usually or very often too optimistic? How can we predict what will make us happy in the future? When should we trust our intuitions and when not? Or what are the effects of cognitive biases when investing in the stock market? Of course, countless other authors have filled the shelves with books about these topics, but most of them did not themselves provide such a large body of the research about which they talk and write. In its review of the book, the Financial Times put it like that: there have been many good books on human rationality and irrationality, but only one masterpiece. That masterpiece is Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow. Thus, ladies and gentlemen, I give you the master talking about his masterpiece.
Thank you. Thank you. It is a pleasure to be here, and I'm very grateful for the extraordinary hospitality that we've enjoyed here. It's a special pleasure, actually, to be here as a guest of Ernst Fehr. Most of you think of Ernst Fehr as a very senior and very serious person, of course, but also as a very senior person. I think of him as a young man, and I remember the first time I heard about Ernst Fehr. That was a little over 20 years ago. I was spending a year in a New York foundation with my close friend, Richard Thaler, who is the guru of behavior economics these days. And Richard had received for refereeing a paper, and he told me, you must read this. This is the beginning of something entirely new in experimental economics. And it was a paper by Ernst Fehr, and I just remember the excitement that he was something completely original from someone, we had never heard of. I mean, other people had, but we had not. And it really turned out to be the beginning of something entirely new in experimental economics, and that was, I won't introduce Ernst Fehr, but so let me just say that it's a pleasure and it's an honor to be his guest. Now, the occasion for the visit is that I've written a book about the way the mind works, and it focuses on two modes of thinking, fast and slow. And I won't, describe it in a great deal of detail, but I just want you to experience a distinction between fast and slow thinking, and it's very easy. Consider these two examples. If I say 2 + 2, something happens to you. And it is important, I'm using the words happens to you because basically you feel passive. Something bubbles up from memory. It's a word. If I say the capital of Russia, a word comes to your mind. If I say the relationship between China and Japan, not a single word comes to your mind, but a whole set of ideas. And, it's not an elaborate story that you could tell, but you are prepared for many things. There are many ideas and many concepts that you are prepared for. If we whispered a series of words, the word island, you would probably find it easy to hear the word island relative to other words because you're prepared for it. You might hear the word war, you might hear the word navy. There are many things that you would think about. And all of this happens to you. Those are things that are memory, delivers to us spontaneously. If I, the example that I use, the standard example is if I say your mother, something happens to you. And what happens to you includes an emotion. Nobody is neutral about their mother. And something happened, and again, you're passive. You didn't decide to have an emotion. You didn't decide to compute anything. But this is the way the mind works in automatic mode. And this is what I call fast thinking. For slow thinking, I have two examples. And one of them is a computation, a multiplication problem. So if I say 17 times 24, there are not many people here who immediately said 408, which happens to be the correct answer. There is a lot that you knew that fast thinking delivered to you. You recognized it as a multiplication problem. You probably knew immediately whether you could do it in your head or you couldn't do it in your head. You actually decided whether or not to do it in your head, and you certainly decided against it. And you also knew immediately that the answer is more than 100 and less than 15,000. So there was something that you knew that was delivered automatically by what I call fast thinking. But this is slow thinking is needed to compute 17 times 24. And if you compute 17 times 24, you will do mental work. And mental work in many ways is like physical work. It has physiological manifestations. Your heart rate will accelerate, your blood pressure will change, the pupil of your eye will dilate significantly, because that's one of the very best measures of mental effort. And for a time, if you actually do this computation, you won't hear me talk. Or if you hear me, you won't understand me, because it is very difficult. I have a young listener here. It is very difficult to do two things at once when both demand effort. That's all right. Now, system two, the way I define it by effort. It's not only slow thinking. So in that sense, the title of the book is slightly misleading, because when you're very angry with somebody and you try not to show it, this is system two also, because that demands work, and actually your heart rate accelerates. And it is work in the sense that it's tiring. You're tired. It is, and we have evidence for that, that it is tiring not to tell people to go to hell when you really want, when this is really what you would like to tell them. So I have called these, and those are not my names. I have adopted terminology. The whole distinction between automatic and effortful thinking is not mine. It was introduced in psychology some 40 years ago, and it's been really developed by many people over the last 15 or 20 years. But I have adopted somebody's terminology, and each of us has his special approach to the concept. I call them type 1 thinking and type 2 thinking. That's many people call them. But I also call them products of system 1 and system 2. And those are metaphors. It is as if there were two systems in the mind. One of them generates those automatic thoughts and emotions and mental responses, and the other generates the effortful ones. So one is fast, effortless, automatic. The second, slower and effortful. The slow system, system 2, involve the control of attention, and attention is really the key. Attention and effort are really the key. However, most of what happens in our mind is really system 1. Most of what actually happens without attention. It happens automatically. Now, I've given you quite a few examples of what system 1 does. So recognizing a friend is system 1. But it's not only that you recognize a name. When you recognize a friend, it is a bit like, the relationship between China and Japan. It's a whole complex of ideas and memories that come to mind. And if your friend looks sad or tired, System 1 will perform another operation. It will act as if it was searching for a cause. That is, when something unusual about a person, you will see, do I know anything that explains why he now looks sad or tired? And that happens automatically. You don't have to decide to look for a cause. Looking for a cause is essentially an automatic process. So, other things that System 1 does, it's involved in skilled behavior. And so, for example, we're all very impressed by chess players who can see a complicated situation and immediately say, white mates in 3 moves. And we think that there is something almost magical about intuition. And a few years ago, actually, I think Malcolm Gladwell wrote an important bestseller called Blink, where he didn't really intend it that way, but it came out as if intuition is magical. But there is really nothing magical about intuition. What happens is that when you have exercised a performance a great deal, under some conditions, and there is regular conditions, and they are when you play chess or when you drive a car, then what initially was a System 2 operation becomes a System 1 operation. So for a master chess player, all the moves that first come to mind are strong moves. Weak moves don't come to their mind. They see a chess game very differently than they did earlier. And very much the same thing happens when we learn to drive, and very much the same thing happens in social context. I mean, all of us, well, there's an example I always use, which involves my wife, that when we speak on the telephone and she says one word, I know her mood. And it's very much like learning to drive. I've had a lot of practice. And there are things that you learn, and once you learn them, they are automatic. What is interesting about driving being automatic is that driving is automatic when it's easy. But when it becomes difficult, so if you're going to make a left turn into traffic, you're not going to be speaking and you're not going to be thinking of other things. And probably you shouldn't, because if you try to, you're not going to be paying attention. So the characteristic of effort and the characteristic of System 2 is that it is limited in its ability to exert effort. And I think we can, I use the word that System 2 is lazy, just to characterize it. But what I mean by that is not a bad judgment about System 2, but simply that it operates on what is known as the law of least effort. And this is something that happens automatically, actually, that when there are different ways of achieving the same goal, effort, the amount of work that is involved, including mental work, is automatically taken into account as a cost. And mental effort is a cost. It seems to be a heavier cost for some of us than for others, but it is a cost for all of us. So generally, System 1 provides an ongoing interpretation of what is going on. And one of its major functions is to recognize abnormalities, to recognize anything that is not normal in context. This is important because there are many situations where it's not that we expect anything in particular. We are not expecting anything. But if something happened that is unexpected, that is surprising, we detect it. And this is System 1. My favorite example of that is a study of people listening to sentences while their brain events are recorded. And the sentence is spoken by an upper-class British male voice. And don't expect me to imitate that. And it says, I have large tattoos all down my back. And now you look at what the brain does. And within about a third of a second, there is a characteristic response of the brain, surprise. And this happened to all of you. And if you think about it, that's a very impressive accomplishment, because what it involves is recognizing the voice as an upper class, British male voice. And then that brings up the stereotype of upper class British males. And then you don't expect them to have large tattoos all down their back. So there is an incongruity. That's a surprise. And the recognition of that is immediate. It's nothing, it's completely effortless. It just happens as part of the process of understanding speech. And as you are listening to me now, you're paying attention, I suppose, I hope, but you're not working very hard. That is, if we measured the size of your pupils, that would be quite small. It's not difficult to listen to a lecture, to a simple lecture. There is an effort in focusing attention, but it's not difficult. Bringing to mind a telephone number or multiplying 17 times 24, that is mental work and a completely different thing. Now, I said that System 1 produces interpretations. And an important feature of an interpretation is coherence. That is, everything fits together. And by coherence, I do not mean logical coherence. I mean emotional and associative coherence, things fitting together. So an example, which is possibly the best example, is something that psychologists call the halo effect. And the halo effect means that if you like somebody, then you expect to like everything about them. And if you dislike somebody, you expect them not to be nice. So one example of the halo effect to dramatize this is that the Adolf Hitler actually liked children very much, and he was very nice to children. And it's a difficult thought to entertain. I mean, it creates tension. And because that's not the kind of stories that System 1 generally creates. Now, another example, in the context of America, it's quite a... If you like President Obama's politics, if you think that his politics are good, you probably like his voice. But if you don't like his politics, you probably notice that he has very big ears. And so that's the way it works. There is coherence, associative and emotional coherence. And System 1 produces coherent stories. And it produces coherent stories even on the basis of very little evidence. And this is, I think, one of the major characteristics of System 1. It is a machine for jumping to conclusions. So when you have minimal amount of evidence, if it fits into a story, you generate that story. And coherence is important for another reason. And it is that it explains the feeling of confidence that we have in judgments and in opinions and in preferences. And, at least in principle, you should be confident of your judgment if the evidence is good, if your reasons are good, if you've thought very carefully about it. But that's not the way confidence is generated. Confidence is a feeling, confidence is an emotion, and it has to do with the coherence of the stories that you're telling yourself, the stories that, in general, System 1 is telling itself. And if you have a simple story, it feels good, and it feels confident, and you have confidence, even when actually the story is based on very little information, and actually even if you know that the story is based on little information. That is, we create those patterns, and if they're good patterns, we're confident in them. A result of that is that the world that we construct in our minds is much simpler than reality. It is much more coherent than reality because of all the possible ways we pick simple stories, and we tend to ignore things that do not fit into the story. So I've given you examples of the contrast to this of System 2. And now let me explain, and the main, in a way, the main theme of the book is about the interaction between these two fictitious characters. Because, of course, there isn't a system 1 and a system 2, living in particular places in the brain. But our subjective experience is much closer to system 2 than to system 1. That is, we tend to be conscious of things that we think about deliberately. We tend to be conscious of the thoughts that we have, that we feel authorship about, that we feel we have made those, we have created those. We therefore exaggerate the role of system 2 because we tend to be aware of cases in which we apply deliberate thinking to overcome an intuitive response. I mean, to overcome a mistake, not to make a mistake, not to say something idiotic, and so on. Now, in these situations, system 1 speaks first, and system 2 stops it, and we're very aware of that. But we tend not to be aware of the most frequent situation. And the frequent situation is one in which our slow thinking is actually guided and controlled to a large extent by our fast thinking. And basically, where slow thinking endorses and rationalizes fast thinking. So I'm giving metaphors a lot today, so let me give you another metaphor to describe how I think all this is happening. And I think of the metaphor of a newspaper room where you have reporters and you have an editor. And the reporters are writing stories about what's going on in the world. And the editor, and they are system 1. And the editor in my story is system 2. And the editor has a lot of work because there are many stories. And the editor, I described him as pretty lazy. And he gets those stories. And in general, he will quickly look at those stories and make a check and send it to the printer. Sometimes he will stop a story, something wrong, and then either stop it altogether so you don't tell the person what you think of him, or modify it and make it more polite, or think about it again, or decide to assign, as it were, another reporter to the story. Let's think about this afresh. But by and large, if you think of the newspaper, and the newspaper is our mental life, if you think of the newspaper, it is mostly the product of system 1. The editor has endorsed it. The editor has sometimes modified it slightly, but basically that's where it comes from. So system 1 is the origin of our mental life. Now, this psychological analysis was developed for individuals. I'm a psychologist. But actually organizations, both private and governmental, are also susceptible to fast thinking. So you can distinguish fast and slow thinking in organizations. And in some cases, it's important to know, groups are not always smarter than individuals. In fact, when a group of people who share the same bias discuss things together, they're worse than individuals. And they're worse because they look at each other, and the fact that others agree with them gives them more confidence that what they think about is right. However, an important difference between organizations and individuals is that I believe that organizations, at least in principle, have a better chance, a better opportunity to avoid biases and to avoid mistakes than individuals do. And so when I think of trying to be constructive about this, I would be more constructive about organizations because they use procedures. It is natural for an organization to think slowly. And then when it thinks slowly, there is an opportunity to think better. Interestingly enough, I find that very few organizations actually try consciously, deliberately, to improve the way in which, the process in which judgments and decisions are made. Now, for the rest of this talk, I'll speak about 3 features of fast thinking, which I think influence many decisions. And those are the three. I will argue that people tend to view choices and decisions much too narrowly, and so they focus on the immediate emotional reaction to the outcome and not on long-term consequences. I will argue that people are much more sensitive to potential losses than to potential gains, and this is a bias that has many consequences. It tends to make people unreasonably risk-averse, and it tends to have many other consequences, not all of them good. And the third bias is that people tend to be optimistic and overconfident. And this bias works in the other way. It tends to make people accept unreasonable risks, which they would reject if they really knew the odds. So I'm going to try in the remaining time to speak about these three things. So let me contrast what I call broad and narrow thinking. And imagine that you lose, 1,000 francs. And the broad way of thinking about it is that you are less wealthy by 1,000 francs. So you had a certain amount of wealth, and now you're less wealthy by 1,000 francs. The narrow way to think about exactly the same thing is to think of this outcome as an event, the event of losing 1,000 francs. And the event is associated with an emotion. Probably the idea of being 1,000 francs poorer is not associated with a big emotion. And even for the young, who may not have all that amount of money in the bank, if you think of your human capital and your future, 1,000 francs is nothing to you. So this is the broad and the narrow way. And it is not an accident. You will have a much stronger emotional reaction if you think narrowly than if you think broadly. If you think of the event than if you think of it as a change in your wealth. Now, fast thinking tends to be narrow. And there are many ways in which that happens. Think of whether you would accept a gamble in which, with equal probabilities, we'll toss a coin, you can lose 100 francs or win 200 francs. Now, if you think broadly about this, in the first place, you will notice that there are many situations in which you have opportunities to gamble at favorable odds. It's not the only problem of its kind. You're not on your deathbed. There will be others. There won't be many that are exactly like this. But in general, life offers many opportunities to gamble. And if you think broadly, you see the choice about this particular gamble as an example of a broader category. And you should have, in principle, if you think broadly, a policy about these gambles. And the policy will be fairly close to risk neutral. And you would take that gamble. But if you think narrowly, you will treat each choice as if it is the only one. And you see the problem in isolation. And then you are much more likely to reject the gamble, and actually most people reject this gamble, which is almost certainly a mistake, because this gamble is better than most investments that people make. But when we make investments, we are less emotional than when we think about the possibility of losing 100 francs right now when the coin shows up on the wrong side. So here, again, is a difference. You will accept the gamble if you think of the problem as an instance of a category for which you have a policy. And narrow thinking, in general, in this example and in many other examples, is a basic cause of unreasonable behaviors. I don't like to use the word irrational, because rationality is a technical term, and almost nobody is rational. But unreasonable is a useful term. And you are more reasonable if you think broadly than if you think narrowly. Now, I would say that encouraging people to apply broad thinking to outcomes and to decision problems is a basic move for improving the reasonableness of choice. It's just broaden the frame. Broaden the frame, the emotions will become much less, and you will see things the way they ought to be seen in the long term. Now, I'll come back to this. The second feature I wanted to talk about is what we've called loss aversion. And loss aversion is simply an asymmetry that people respond more strongly to losses than to gains. So the example I gave you of that gamble illustrates this. In fact, we know in many situations, not all, but there have been really too many examples for it to be completely accidental. We know by how much the losses are weighted more than gains, and it seems to be a little more than 2 to 1. That's why people, on average, don't like the gamble that I mentioned, because the pain of losing 100, the anticipated pain of losing 100, is worse than the anticipated pleasure of winning 200. So that's the asymmetry between losses and gains. And this asymmetry causes us to make many mistakes. So imagine someone who has a stable income and it changes abruptly, from, say, 1,000 to 1,500, or it changes from 1,500 back to 1,000. The response to the loss is going to be more intense than the response to the gain. And that's loss aversion. And in a way that really doesn't make sense, and it is assumed in economics, in the standard treatment of economics, where utility for money is the utility of wealth. When you are thinking of wealth, then going up and going down is exactly the same thing. It gives the same result. But when you think in terms of gains and losses, it is not the same result. And you have an emotional response, and it is not a very good idea to have that. Actually, the analysis of loss aversion is probably the major focus of behavior economics. And for example, there are responses to price changes. So price changes influence demand. But this is not symmetric. Price increases and price decreases do not have the same effect. The effect is stronger to price increases, which are losses. So demand drops more than it gains, at least in the short term. And this has been observed several times, this difference in elasticity of demand. For another example, this is a study carried out by the experimental economist John List. He did it in China, but I think he's now replicated it in the United States. You can describe a bonus in 2 different ways. So in the experiment that was run in a factory in China where the productivity of individual workers is monitored, they were given a target and a bonus for exceeding that target. And the bonus could be framed in one of 2 ways. So the standard way is if you exceed the target, you will get the bonus. The other way is you have the bonus, but if you don't reach the target, you will lose it. People work harder in the second frame than in the first frame. And they work harder, this is a difference of 1% in productivity, which, as John List points out, is economically significant. And this is for just wording, just the way that things are presented as a losses or as a gain. Loss aversion is one of the reasons that reforms of any kind, within organizations, within countries, are much more expensive than expected. And this is because in any reform, you have winners and you have losers, and the losers fight harder than the winners. And the losers demand to be compensated for their losses. And this is something that, in general, the government or the institution that is planning the reform does not expect the enormous difference in intensity between the fighting spirit of the losers and the winners. And losers tend to be compensated, and that causes reforms to be expensive. More generally, loss aversion produces a bias that favors the status quo. And this is true for individuals as well as in individuals' life. If you are in a certain position, at a certain job, and now you're considering the possibility of moving to another job, the way that we think of the other job is in terms of advantages and disadvantages relative to the current job. Advantages are gains, disadvantages are losses. The disadvantages get weighed much more than the advantages. And that is why, by and large, people stay put in their jobs and with their wives and in many other aspects of life, is that the cost of switching, the loss of switching, is weighted more than the advantages of switching. And that tends to produce the status quo. In negotiations, for example, think of labor negotiations. So you have two sides, and there is an existing contract, and now the time has come to renegotiate the contract. Now, the previous contract defines the reference point, and relative to which you gain or you lose. And something really very interesting happens here in negotiations. The concession that you make to me, they are gains to me, but to you they're losses. So you put a lot more weight on the concessions you make to me than I do. And it's exactly the same for me. I hate making concessions to you because that's a loss to me. And then you don't appreciate them as much as you should. And that gap, loss aversion, is a very important obstacle to successful negotiations. So loss aversion is generally, it keeps us stable, it keeps us in the status quo, but it is also the cause of many difficulties and many mistakes. And of course, loss aversion is an extremely important source of risk aversion, as in the example of the gamble that I mentioned earlier. Now, loss aversion is biologically adaptive. Threats are generally more urgent than opportunities. But if we're interested in rational decisions, the asymmetric treatment of losses and gains should be viewed as a bias. It is a mistake. It tends to produce inferior decisions, just as narrow framing tends to produce inferior decisions. Loss aversion tends to produce inferior decisions. And now, I'd like to turn for a few minutes to some situation in which the asymmetry is reduced and loss aversion is reduced. Decision makers who decide for somebody else, so I make the decision, you will experience the outcomes, in general, don't have loss aversion. So when agents are making decisions for somebody else, they do not have the 2-to-1 discrepancy. Gains, losses, it's very much easier to be unemotional when you're making decisions for somebody else. Now, the leaders, national leaders, leaders of organizations, they make many decisions that cause others to experience gains and losses. And actually, they must weigh the gains and the losses. But if they do not feel loss aversion, they're going to be surprised by the reaction to the move they make. So the fact that agents and leaders are less susceptible to loss aversion is in many ways a good thing, because advisors and agents are able to avoid the short-term view and to focus on long-term consequences. But it's not easy. Now, one implication of this, I think, is that it's a very good idea when you have a problem to ask for advice from friends, because your friends are going to be less loss-averse than you are. And that is useful. And the costs are, as I indicated, that leaders are likely to make mistakes. And in particular, organizations that impose changes that on balance look positive may be surprised by the intensity of the opposition to the changes. Now, there is something else that reduces loss aversion and also reduces narrow framing, and this is experience. So experience in particular in trading, and there are many experimental demonstrations of that now. In general, there is, in many situations, you can observe something that we've called the endowment effect. And that, well, let me describe very briefly the original experiment on that. In that experiment, we and that Dick Thaler, and whom I've already mentioned, and Jack Netch and myself, we gave people a mug, and a choice, actually, between a mug and money. But for half of these people, we first gave them the mug, and then we gave them the opportunity to sell it. So you could give up, you could sell the mug and get some money. Other people got a choice. You could have a mug or you could have money. Now, if you think about it, those two situations are exactly the same, because if I'm a subject in that experiment, I can go home with a mug or I can go home with money. So it should be the same amount of money, but it isn't. The people who sell the mug demand twice as much money, approximately, as the choice equivalent. And the reason is straightforward. It's because people have narrow framing. They don't think of having the mug. They think if they have a mug, they think of giving it up. And if they don't have a mug, they think of getting it. And getting it is a gain, giving it up is a loss. And people have a different response to gains and to losses. Now, this behavior is completely eliminated among experienced traders. So people who have a lot of experience in trading apparently are able to neutralize loss aversion. And what they do, which is also the way that successful negotiations work, they value things at par. So for example, in routine transactions, if I buy a pair of shoes, I don't feel loss aversion for the money I spend unless I'm very poor. And if I'm very poor, it's because by spending money on the shoes, there's something else I must give up. And certainly the merchant who sells me the shoes doesn't experience selling me the shoes as a loss of shoes. In routine trading, there is no endowment effect. And experienced traders are immune or largely immune to the endowment effect, which is interesting. And another way in which experience helps is viewing life as a repeated game. And this is what I said earlier in the context of narrow and broad view. And I think there is one phrase that you hear a lot in the United States, in English-speaking languages. It is, you win a few, you lose a few. I think, that phrase is a key to rational behavior, to reasonable behavior, because it is a statement that integrates over multiple decisions. You win a few, you lose a few. That means that this particular loss isn't so painful, because you win a few, you lose a few. So this is the way in which I think reasonableness of decisions can be improved by broadening the view. And that happens automatically with experience, and it can sometimes happen by reframing the decisions. Now, so experienced traders in financial markets and in other markets don't seem to have much endowment effect, but many important decisions are made with little opportunity to acquire skills. So, people change jobs a few times in their lives, and they marry, once or twice or three times, and they don't get a lot of experience, not enough experience to become completely free of loss aversion. I said I would speak about three things, and let me switch to the last one. And I'll speak about optimistic overconfidence. Now, loss aversion favors risk aversion, aversion to risk. And yet we see a considerable amount of risk-taking. And risk-taking not only by people who are in repeated play. We see entrepreneurs, they take big risks, and so on. Entrepreneurial risk-taking is widespread, and it plays a very favorable role in the economy. But starting a business is a gamble in which a loss is possible, and actually even likely. In the United States, at least, people open a small business. Within 5 years, 2/3 of them shut down. So failure is more likely than success. But why do we see so much entrepreneurial activity? Well, the answer is that entrepreneurs do not know the odds that they're facing. They think their odds are much better than 1 in 3. They think their odds may be 4 in 5. And so that allows people who are basically loss averse, they will take risks because they don't know the risks that they're taking. And this is my main theory of how people take risks is that they don't know the odds that they're facing. And that, now there is absolutely no guarantee that those two biases, which operate in opposite directions, loss aversion and optimism, are of equal strength, so that you end up exactly where you should be. But there clearly are those two biases, and you can study them independently, and you can do something about them, and probably it's better not to fix one of them without fixing the other as well. Now, optimism, like loss aversion, is everywhere in decision making. I mean, we are by and large born optimists, and most of us. It is relevant in planning, and most areas of planning are optimistic, and in some cases very optimistic. The effect has been called the planning fallacy, which is that people who should know better have it. I had it, I wrote about it actually. I've written extensively the planning fallacy I invented. But when I started on my book, I told my friend Dick Thaler that I would finish it in 18 months, and he laughed very loudly, and he said, somebody has written about the planning fallacy. Now, it took me 4.5 years, and it was very, very painful. So the planning fallacy is really everywhere, and there are cognitive reasons for it. Now, again, what do we do about optimism? And optimism, like loss aversion, has pros and cons. I mean, in general, optimistic people are happier, and they do more, and they live longer, and a lot. If you can wish one thing for your child, it is to be an optimist, because they will have a better life. But there are contexts where you really don't want optimism. But as, for example, I have a financial advisor, and I have no interest whatsoever in his being an optimist. So there are many contexts where, in fact, optimism is detrimental and leads to losses. And controlling it in organizations sets many problems, because in some way, an organization functions better if its goals are at the boundary of the realistic, or even beyond what is realistic. But on the other hand, not knowing what's going to happen can sometimes, and actually quite often, cause a lot of trouble. So, where I think optimism is a net loss is in situations of conflict. So it's, I think, really very clear that there are very few wars that start where there are not optimistic generals on at least one side, and usually on both sides. I mean, wars, when you look at them retrospectively, are much worse than expected. World War I, both sides, the war started in August, and both sides thought they would be home by Christmas. And it was even worse than my book. It took 4.5 years, and 20 million dead, and they had no idea what they were starting when they started. And this is true in wars, and it is true in litigation, and it is true in many conflicts, that the optimism of people and what we call the illusion of control, the sense that they can impose their will on the situation or on other people, has disastrous consequences. So, I have gone on a little too long. I've talked about 3 problems. I talked about System 1 and System 2, and about 3 characteristics. System 1 has many characteristics, but all these 3 are in System 1. And we think narrowly, we're averse to losses, and we tend to be very optimistic. And thinking narrowly, I think, is a net loss. There's really very little that can be said in favor of thinking narrowly. But loss aversion and optimism, the picture is more complicated, but that's the way that we're built. We have that. And I don't think that individuals can do very much about it. But when I think about organizations, I think they can do something about it. So an organization that is aware of optimism and an organization that is aware of loss aversion has, I think, an advantage and a clearer picture of what the world really is like. Thank you very much.
So there is now the opportunity to ask a few questions. Sorry, Danny.
Okay.
But maybe you sit down here.
I'm all right.
Makes it easier. Who wants to ask a question? So we have microphones in the room, in the middle. Who is playing the icebreaker? Over there.
What is the role of innovation then? If we are overly optimistic, then it should be bad to innovate.
I didn't
The role
hear
of
the question.
innovation.
Can you repeat the question?
You tell me.
What is
You
the
can hear.
role? What is the role of innovation in this context? Because when we are overly optimistic, then we have a tendency to perhaps innovate, to bring new ideas to the table, and it turns out to be bad in the end.
I have called optimism the engine of capitalism. So I certainly think, that you must have it. So you must have entrepreneurs that don't know the odds that they're facing, and that is very good for the economy. So many of them will fail, but the economy clearly benefits. You have inventors, and there's a very large study of inventors has been done in Canada. And it's clear that inventors who are looking for patents and they're hoping for commercial success really overestimate their chances of success greatly. But invention, is absolutely essential, invention and innovation. So whether the individual is well served, that is, if you think of an individual who is really loss averse and wouldn't want to take those risks, but he doesn't know the risks that he's taking, that's a complicated thing. For society, innovation, entrepreneurial activity is clearly good for the economy and good for society. There is an interesting dilemma. Somebody in the UK wrote, I forget her name now, at LSE, wrote an interesting article about government subsidies for entrepreneurs and for inventors. And if the government knows that most of these people, something that most of these people don't know, which is that they're most likely to lose their money, should the government help them lose their money? And and actually when you think about that, the answer is not obvious.
There's a question over there, down there.
There are two words which you've used, but you haven't used them, I think, deliberately. You haven't used them systematically, namely emotion or emotions and intellect. And to what extent is system one more emotional, if you like, and system two more intellectual? Or would you not use these terms in these two systems?
No, I think I view emotion as one aspect as a type 1 activity. It's something, if we want to continue with this metaphor, it's system 1. But it's a type 1 activity in the sense that emotions are largely automatic. And the opposite, system 2, we should know that system 2 is not necessarily rational. So system 2 doesn't, there are many things we don't know, and you can compute 17 times 24 and not find 408. It's very easy for system 2 to make mistakes as well. But what we call reasoning is a system 2 activity because it's extended over time and it involves mental work.
Maybe I give you mine.
Thank you. Well, you were talking at the beginning about the unsymmetry between earning and losses, and mainly about individuals. And later you went on to organizations, and as I understand, the organization would balance the unsymmetry, would more or less equalize it. And my question, you have that the organization is correcting, is amending this unsymmetry. And my question is, isn't that over-optimistic? Because organizations have procedures, have structures, and they quite often are biased to a particular opinion or a particular assessment. And I think it's rather optimistic to say they balance the attitudes.
There is maybe I'm going to answer a slightly different question than the one that you asked. So if so, I apologize. What is the role of optimism and loss aversion in organization, and how is it controlled? I mentioned Richard Thaler, the guru of behavioral economics, and a very, very clever man. And he once gave a seminar to a large group of executives, including the CEO of the company. And he asked them a question. Suppose that in your line of business, in your division, you were faced with a gamble that is, in effect, you lose 100 or you win 200 with equal probability. What would you do? And most of them said, I wouldn't take it. And then he turned to the CEO and he says, what is your opinion? The CEO said, I would want them to take them all, because there are statistical factors that operate in large organizations, but loss aversion, the degree of loss aversion, seems to be almost the same for small decisions and for larger decisions. Not quite the same, but almost the same. And if you stop to think about it, that doesn't make sense. And an organization that would want to control loss aversion should think very carefully how to do this.
How is it possible that risk aversion and over-optimism can coexist? Could you just give one example? Because if we assume that people are generally over-optimistic, normally they should just oversee or they should just ignore any risks. And if we assume that people are very risk-averse, they would never run the risk to become overly optimistic.
Well, we are loss averse independently of optimism. So, and in general, there's a lot of evidence, not that for both humans and other animals, that we're more sensitive to losses than to gains. So loss aversion just exists independently of risk, and independently of uncertainty. It's just there. And we're optimistic even when we don't have control. So those are just two facts about human nature that and you can see where they might come from and what is the evolutionary advantage. Clearly, there's an obvious evolutionary advantage to loss aversion, but there probably is a biological advantage to optimism too. And so they're contradictory in a way, but they're both useful.
So a final question here. Sorry. Looking at one side.
Mr. Kahneman, you spoke only briefly about organizations. You just said organizations are slow thinkers. I agree. But basically, well, what about efficiency? Narrow thinking, loss aversion, optimism. Well, how to proceed? I think, well, large organizations like, for example, the United Nations are not very efficient in my aspect.
Well, the United Nations was not designed for efficiency, but but if you think of a commercial enterprise, it is designed for efficiency, and so if it is susceptible to biases, then it may want to control those biases, and in some cases, I think it is possible. For individuals, it's very clear that in order to control biases, you want to slow down. Now, we can't always slow down, but occasionally when the problem is big, important, then you want to slow down and maybe ask a friend or sleep over it. Now, organizations have procedures, and in principle, there are procedures to control loss aversion, and there are procedures to control many cognitive biases, including optimism. Now, not many organizations impose those procedures, and that is very interesting. That is why aren't there sort of reasonable procedures, a sort of standard practice? Why isn't there a lot of demand for rational decision making? And there isn't much, and that's why there isn't much is a very interesting story. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let's give him a hand again.
Thank you. Okay. I survived. I survived.
Yeah. So just an announcement, over the next few months we will have further events. One event that I vividly recall that we will organize will be on 1st of October. Joe Stiglitz will come to Switzerland, and we will have a public discussion with another speaker that's not yet determined. It's 1st of October at the University of Basel this time, not at the University of Zurich. But we will have other important events at the University of Zurich in the future. Thank you for coming. Thank you, Danny, for being here. It was a very interesting talk. Thank you.